Hi YouTube, welcome back to my channel. It's been a couple of weeks since my last video, and for that I apologise. It's been a busy old time. I actually just got back from another hen do, which has been a lot of fun, and I am covered in mosquito bites all over my arms, my legs, my back. They're everywhere. In case you were wondering what those red marks are all over my arms, apparently mosquitoes love me. What can I say? I'm really trying not to itch them, but they are driving me insane. So I'm going to distract myself by talking to you about muscle growth. So in my last intake for the Recomp Blueprint, I had the overwhelming majority of people coming to me wanting muscle growth as their main goal. So in the past, I've definitely seen more of a fat loss focus from most of the people that are wanting to start working with me in one-to-one coaching. And it was amazing to see so many women wanting to really prioritize actually building some strength, building some muscle, because I think people are starting to realize that actually that kind of lean and toned physique that they're looking for requires a lot more muscle than they might think. So that goal of wanting to tone up really is only going to come from spending a good amount of time building muscle. As a result of that being the main goal for a lot of people in this intake, I've been talking a lot about the best possible ways to build muscle and what methods you need to use in order to do that. So I wanted to share my view with you on the best way to do so. And I wanted to dive in a little bit more into the concept of building muscle at maintenance versus building muscle as part of a bulk or a caloric surplus, and really which method is best depending on where you're at in your journey. So I wanted to start with what the non-negotiables are for building muscle tissue. I think along the way, there has been a narrative around if you want to grow, you're going to need to eat in a surplus. And that actually isn't true. There are a few things that you cannot avoid if you're wanting to build muscle, but a caloric surplus isn't necessarily one of them. So what are the things? You are going to need to be resistance training, period. Now, in terms of volume and frequency, you're probably wanting to aim for anywhere north of 10 sets per muscle group per week. Now, you can split that up however you like, and it is, of course, going to depend on how many times you're going to train and what muscle groups you're wanting to bias in terms of volume for growth. As a really high level guideline, you're going to want to aim for at least 3 sessions per week in an ideal world. Of course, 2 is better than none, but really we're wanting to shoot for 3 or 4 if we're thinking about that volume that I mentioned of 10 working sets or more per muscle group per week. So you're wanting to find the sweet spot of training volume for you, depending on where your training experience is at, how much available time you have, but you can take those things into account as kind of baseline guidelines. Now, when it comes to resistance training, if you're ticking that box, amazing. But that in and of itself, showing up to the gym, going through the motions, is not enough. The principle of progressive overload cannot be overlooked. Training must be consistent. It must be challenging. If you are brand new to a gym setting, then you can probably get away with being quite unstructured with your training. You can hop between different programs day in, day out, and probably still see some results. You may even see some results from things like fitness classes. Again, in detrained individuals, your strategy does not need to be quite so specific. But if you've already been training a couple of times a week for, say, 6 months, you are going to find that you need to be adding in that progressive overload to see muscle growth. Progressive overload essentially means you are making things harder every time you step into the gym, or at least that's the intention. You're adding weight, you're adding reps. The demand is getting larger. Now, progressive overload is the tool that we use, but the thing that is really responsible for muscle growth is mechanical tension. Sounds complicated, really it isn't. It's simply a case of training with a close proximity to failure. It's the force placed on your muscle fibers when they contract against resistance. So we want to be aiming to challenge your muscles under load with good form through a full range of motion and with close proximity to failure. If we think about a set of 10 reps on a leg press, rep 1 and rep 10 should not look the same. We should be choosing loads and performing the exercise with the right form so that we find when we get to reps 8, 9, and 10, the rep speed is obviously slowing down. You are not able to push that platform away from you with the same speed and force as you could at the start of the set. Reps 8, 9, and 10 that I just mentioned are what we call effective reps. Those are the reps that are going to be effective for hypertrophy, for muscle growth. So really, reps 1 to 7 are just a stimulus to get you to that point. Those are the reps that count. So we don't stop when it feels hard or when it starts to burn. We stop when we physically can see rep speed is slowing down and we are unable to perform the exercise in the same way as we could at the beginning. So you've got to be training and you've got to be applying progressive overload with a focus on maximizing mechanical tension. People talk about this next one all the time, but it really does matter. Protein. Consistently hitting adequate levels of protein is the most important thing you can do nutritionally for muscle growth. And you want to be aiming for somewhere between 1.6 and 2.2 grams of protein per kilo of body weight. If you're already someone who's relatively lean, or you're someone in a caloric deficit, you're going to want to shoot for the upper end of that. I normally aim for 2 grams just because the maths is easy. And the other one I want to talk about before we discuss whether you go down the maintenance or bulking route is recovery and sleep. Poorer sleep leads to poorer recovery, which means poorer muscle protein synthesis. That is the function of muscle building. You're going to want 7 to 9 hours of quality sleep. And you do need a rest day. Doing more does not mean better results. So whatever your position, you need to be doing all of those things. Now, when it comes to doing this at maintenance or doing this in a surplus, I want to start by saying it is 100% possible to build significant muscle mass at maintenance if you're doing all of the things that I've just spoken about. I have personally never done a bulk. I have personally never taken a client through a bulk. And that's because we are general population people who happen to go to the gym regularly. I would imagine most of you are not professional athletes or bodybuilders. You might just want to tone up a bit, have a bit of definition around your torso or your arms. You might have a very busy life, young children, a demanding job, little time availability. If you're doing things like getting a good amount of protein in your diet, keeping your meals fairly regular, prioritizing fiber in the form of vegetables or fruit, then you're already doing more than the average person. Think about it like this. If I was to give a busy mum of 2, who's lucky if they get to the gym 3 times a week, a calorie surplus, because that's what they need to do to build muscle, you can probably guess what's going to happen there. You will likely see that you gain more body fat than you would like. Because frankly, a calorie surplus is a calorie surplus. It does not matter whether you clean bulk or dirty bulk. Calories are calories. And if you have an excess of calories over a sustained period of time, body fat will increase. In short, if you've been training less than a few years and your overall nutrition approach is pretty good but could maybe use some work, then a calorie surplus in the pursuit of building muscle is not necessary. What you might want to do though is make sure you're eating at the upper end of what's called your maintenance range. So maintenance calories are not a static number. Let's say my maintenance calories are 2,200 a day. If I was to eat 2,250 calories per day for a week, that does not necessarily mean I'm in a surplus all of a sudden. Your maintenance exists on a range. And if you think about it, it totally makes sense. Some days you're going to be expending less energy. Other days you're going to be expending much more. Everything is moving and changing on a daily basis. So I would recommend testing out your maintenance range and eating at the upper end of that. And if you've got no idea what I'm talking about, you want to watch my last video. Now, here's who I would recommend a calorie surplus for. People who want to pack on as much muscle as possible in a short period of time, such as professional bodybuilders or bikini athletes. Bulking and cutting is part of the sport. And yes, muscle gain will be quicker in a strategic calorie surplus. But again, for the average gym goer, just not needed. Outside of that camp, honestly, I would only suggest a surplus is needed for someone who is an advanced trainee. So I'm thinking you've been training for 5 years, smart, and hard. You've also got your nutrition dialed in. You know exactly what works for your body. You know where your maintenance range is. You know where your deficit range is. You know what your energy needs are. You respond to them intuitively. If you are in that position and you're finding that muscle growth is becoming harder and harder, because it will, then a surplus may be a useful tool. Now, if that's you and you're thinking about how to figure out what a surplus might be, it might be less than you think. When we think about creating a deficit target, we generally look at between 10 and 20% of calories being reduced. When it comes to a surplus, it's probably smart to make that range a little smaller. We're thinking maybe 5 to 15%. So let's take my previous example of 2,200 being roughly my maintenance. If we're thinking about 5% on top of that, we're looking at a whole 110 extra calories a day. It's not a huge increase. Even at the upper end of that range, we're looking at 300 calories. The reason I wanted to raise this is because I think people often assume that a caloric surplus means that you have to eat a lot more food. Again, unless you're a competitor and you're wanting this process to be as fast and efficient as possible, you can stick to very modest guidelines when it comes to your surplus. So when it comes to macronutrients in a surplus, really you don't need to tweak protein all that much, especially if you're already hitting that 1.6 to 2.2 gram range that I mentioned. Then when it comes to carbs and fats, this is pretty flexible. Once you've got that protein box ticked, we then want to focus on filling the remaining calories with mostly carbs. This is going to support your training performance, your recovery, and your glycogen replenishment. Now, this doesn't mean fats don't matter. They absolutely do. You probably want to make sure you've got at least 20 to 25% of your overall calories coming from fats. When it comes to things like meal timings and protein absorption from each meal, there seems to be some sort of narrative around only being able to absorb a certain amount of protein per meal that you eat. This has been proved largely untrue. The most important thing is total protein intake. So worry less about your anabolic window at the end of your workout or getting in a specific amount of protein before you train, and worry more about what happens by the end of the day. Now, the other thing that's important to mention when it comes to considering the idea of a bulk is that body fat will inevitably increase, even if you stick to the lower end of that surplus and you approach it in a way that is very similar to your maintenance, except just with a little bit more food. As I said, a surplus is a surplus. Body fat gain is inevitable, but you can limit that by staying at the bottom end of that range. And like I say, not treating it as a free-for-all. Now, with that in mind, you must be prepared for that to be the case. Do not expect to look leaner and leaner each week when you are in a bulk. Do not expect the scales to stay exactly the same when you are in a bulk. You are quite literally, intentionally eating more than you need in the pursuit of muscle gain, which is a great thing, but you can't expect that to not weigh something or make you look slightly different in the short term. So if you're comfortable with the scale weight changing, which you should be, but a lot of us aren't, and if you're comfortable with looking a little bit fluffier than you do right now, again, which you should be, but a lot of us aren't, then great. But what you don't want to be doing is deciding next week I'm going to go into a bulk, and then after a couple of weeks you feel a bit fluffy and think, fuck it, I'll go into a deficit. Commit to the plan, accept the inevitable, track your progress, take your progress pictures, track your lifts, track your energy levels. If all of the markers are showing improvements, then you know you're on the right track. You want to commit to a bulk for at least a few months, because muscle growth takes time. In terms of the perfect amount of time to spend in a bulk before you then do a cut to reveal what you've built, it's going to vary so much from person to person. It can be really helpful to have a coach if you're considering a bulk. When it comes to the increase in calories that you're consuming, it's going to be really useful to get most of those from protein, as lean and complete a protein source as you can get, ideally animal-based and ideally fairly low fat. And that's because calories that come from protein are far less likely to be stored as body fat, even when in a caloric surplus, especially when you're resistance training, which is actually super interesting. I'm going to pop the studies here for you to look at if you're interested. So the TLDR is, if you are an average gym goer who's just wanting to tone up a bit, build a bit of muscle mass, get strong, maintenance is the way. It's slightly slower, but it will happen, and it's going to avoid you getting into a position where you feel like you've gained excess body fat in the process. If you are someone who has everything dialed in, you've been training for a long time, you're not worried about the scale increase, you're not worried about feeling a little bit more fluffy, and you want to build muscle as quickly as possible, then a slight caloric surplus with a focus on any extra calories coming from protein where possible is going to be a great strategy for you. I really hope that was helpful. Please do pop your questions in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you this time next week. Okay, love you, bye.